Welcome to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership, where you'll hear insights and useful strategies, as well as lessons learned from other nonprofit leaders and valuable tips from a variety of experts. Here to help you with the challenges and opportunities you face day after day is your host and nonprofit leadership expert, Sarah Olivieri.
Hello, nonprofit leaders, and welcome to your go-to place for information and inspiration to help you be even more effective. I'm your host, Sarah Olivieri, and today you're listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. My guest for this episode is Carol Hamilton, who is the principal of Grace Social Sector Consulting and host of her own podcast, Mission Impact, which I highly recommend you check out. She facilitates whole brain, equity-focused strategic planning and evaluation design and organizational assessments for both nonprofits and associations. She combines left brain strategy and analysis with right brain wisdom about human complexities for a proven whole brain, whole organization process through which every stakeholder thrives. She's also a member of a consultant group focused on equity-focused organization development, which we're going to be talking about integrating equity into strategic planning today. So welcome, Carol. Before we dive into our topic, would you just tell us, talking about whole brain, whole body, who are you as a person outside of your nonprofit expertise?
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you, Sarah, for having me on the podcast. It's great to be here with you. I was actually, it's always funny to listen to your own bio be read back to you. And I think I grew up probably favoring one side of my brain, that analytical part. And as I've, grown and matured, definitely needed to learn a lot more about leaning into a whole body, a whole brain experience of, we are human beings with emotions and feelings. I didn't grow up being allowed to have either of those, but they're there. So learning all those things. And so that's what I like to bring to clients, that understanding that we are whole human beings. And I think, I'm a grandmother, a sister of a person with a disability. And so growing up with him as my older brother, definitely saw the many ways in which the world was not designed for him. And so, kind of opened my eyes to how structures don't necessarily work for everybody.
Yeah, I love it. Well, thank you for being here. Let's start talking about integrating equity into strategic planning. Let's just start with a very basic question. Let's just define when you talk about equity, how do you define it? What are you thinking about?
So I'm thinking about who's at the table. I'm thinking about the different access points that people have, who's being listened to. And then not only that, but a realization of the many ways in which the structures that we live in, and honestly, many of the assumptions that are built into kind of what's known as best practice in nonprofit management favor a certain group of people. And so what do the folks who have been in historically marginalized communities need to fully participate? And then for those folks who with dominant identities, what are they not seeing because the world is built for them? So bringing that perspective of how can we, it's not about making it an even playing field, but what does each person need to fully participate, and being aware of those. And then to really have not only the process, but ultimately, hopefully the goals as well, have those things in mind.
So there's really two pieces here, is that the planning process can be equitable, and then what goes into the plan could also have that lens of equity.
Yeah, I think it is about bringing that lens, and I think you can bring that lens to any aspect or any function within kind of running an organization. And, I work with strategy just because, again, going back to that analytical side, that's kind of my strengths, and seeing all those connections. And I've lost my train of thought. Okay.
That's very good. I have a puppy running amok in the other room. So, trains of thoughts, out they go. But
Out
no,
they
so you're
go.
saying, you work with strategy, right? And I think,
Oh, I know what I was going to say.
okay, go ahead.
So strategy, and we have the truism, a quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so, I've always wanted to help organizations have healthier organizational cultures. And I think as a white person, I was probably a little late to the game to realize that means, by definition, to have a healthy culture, you have to have an inclusive culture that recognizes all the people that are there and creates that sense of belonging, creates those pathways to equity. So that's kind of a baseline to then that work around, okay, where are we all going together? What's our shared vision, and how are we going to get there?
I love it. Okay, so we're talking about, that equity lens, and you mentioned, being a white person, but what are some of the other lenses that we need to be considering besides race when we're thinking about equity?
Well, I think we need to not avoid race, but I think there are obviously many aspects of identity that people bring to any process, whether it's those that are visible, race, gender identity. You can go through the long list, disabilities, which can be apparent, can be not apparent. So there are many intersections. And of course, with more and more intersections of historically marginalized identities, the more barriers that the society puts in someone's way to be fully recognized as a human being. I loved how you started to let's humanize each other, and I think that's ultimately what it's all about.
Yeah, it's so true. I used to work in organizations with adults on the autism spectrum, and often, unless they have very, severe autism where they're not speaking, that's often invisible disability. And attending meetings, it could be something like, if there's fluorescent lights in the room, they can't be fully present. Or they may need, some additional supports to be able to really have access to that room. But of course, yes, absolutely not to avoid race at all. So let's go there and let's talk about the process of strategic planning and bringing equity to the table in that process. What are the things that you're doing to make that happen when you work with a client?
Yeah, and let me step back one, because a lot of times folks will ask, if I ask about what they've done as an organization around diversity, equity, and inclusion, justice, belonging, all those things, they'll kind of look at me like, wait a second, we're talking about strategic planning. Why are you asking me about that? And if for organizations, especially if they're either majority white folks or white topped with even though they may have a diversity of staff throughout the organization, if their leadership is really dominated by those of us in the dominant culture, they probably need to do some work that really focuses specifically on that before they try to integrate it into their full organizational strategy. So there is that. Ultimately, we want to have it all integrated. But sometimes when you're learning something new, and again, this is, when you're learning something new, you may have to focus on that specifically.
Yeah.
And then and then you start thinking about, okay, how do we integrate this into everything we do? But for the process itself, it's for each stage really thinking about who are we including? How are we setting up the process so that it can be as inclusive as possible? And it's a lot of micro decisions actually along the way that just are always bringing that to the front. And I'm not going to pretend that I've got all the answers or I've got it all figured out. It's definitely been a learning journey for me.
Yeah, interesting. So I want to ask you a question about, when I see people talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI, and I often like to talk about inequity and anti-bias and anti-inequity, because as much as it's nice to focus on the positive, I often feel like calling out what we're working against actively is much more productive. And I'm wondering if you have an opinion about that or some experience that you could share about whether we're tackling from the pro or the anti side of the conversation.
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say it's one of those polarities that you're kind of going back and forth between. I think there's always, I want to be helping an organization think about what they're moving toward. So those positive things, how do they build the organization so that it really does work for everybody? And at the same time, there may be those barriers that they need to recognize and acknowledge. So everybody has bias.
Yeah.
We can't live in the world without bias because biases are simply our brain's shortcuts to make sense of the world.
Right.
And so everybody has them. There are no impartial people. There's no objective lens. That doesn't exist in humans. So let's just all acknowledge we have bias. And then we can learn more about what those are. And we can question them and we can unpack them and we can start being aware of them. So It's not about any individual being a bad person. Everybody comes to this with their full intention to be a good person. But what are they not being? What can't they see because of the identity they have, how they've been socialized, all those things. And how can we just kind of widen our lens, really?
Yeah. So I'm speaking of lenses, I think one of the challenges of addressing issues around equity is like we've talked about, right? We could be talking about, we might talk generally, but when we get into the nitty gritty of what goes on in a racial landscape around inequity and biases is a whole complex topic. And it's not necessarily what goes on in, people with developmental disabilities. And it's not necessarily the same, there's a whole another set of complexities to learn about with gender bias. So how do you handle when it's such a huge, there's so many intricacies on so many levels. How do you begin to handle this with groups of people who are coming to the table with you?
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to deal with all of it in one process. Mm-hmm. And of course, of all those groups that you just talked about, there are people who have all of those identities together in an intersection. So it's both. I think it's asking questions. It's being curious about who you're including. If you're, asking people that you serve to participate in the process in some way, what are you addressing so that they can fully participate? Are you providing childcare? Are you providing stipends? Are you, compensating them for their time? Are you providing transportation? All those things. Not assuming that they can just donate their time and energy to the organization.
There's a big one, right? Can people show up at the meeting physically?
Can people show up at the meeting? Can people show up at the focus group? Can they understand the questions that you're asking? Do you need an interpreter? Are you aware of for each group of people that you're talking to or each individual, what their literacy level might be? Are you talking to them in a second language? Just being aware and thinking about those things. Mm-hmm. You're not going to think of everything. You're going to make mistakes. There's no way to deal with all of it. Right? I mean, patriarchy has been around for 10,000 years, racism for 500. You're not solving it in one strategic planning process. But the more that you can be aware of it, I think everybody is helped by that.
Yeah, I love that. Well, we're going to take a break to hear a word from our sponsor, and then we're going to come back for some more nuggets on integrating equity into strategic planning. Today's episode is being brought to you by Pivot Ground, which I created to assist people like you, executive directors, board members, and other nonprofit leaders. I want to help you unleash your full potential and advance your missions that I know you care about so deeply. I've been an executive director, a board member, and now I am a consultant and coach. I know your challenges firsthand. I've been there, secretly fixing things in the middle of the night, feeling overwhelmed, stressed out, not knowing where to go. And now I want to bring you information and inspiration and encouragement to support you in making the greatest impact possible. My gift for you today is a puppy. No, I'm just kidding. It's a newsletter where you can receive weekly tips for nonprofit leaders just like you in bite-sized chunks that are easy to digest. You can access the newsletter at pivotground.com/sign up, and I'll also include a link in the show notes. All right, let me get back to my conversation with Carol Hamilton. So let's get a little more tactical for organizations thinking about, have I done this already? Or do I need to do this? Or I want to do this? Where should they be thinking as kind of step one?
Well, I think that the step one is thinking, what have you done in this arena before? Will this be the first time you're kind of centering this topic in your process? And if so, you probably need to do some directed work around that.
So let's go down that route for a moment. So for the first timers, right? So you're coming new to this, because imagine it's gonna be a very different approach. I know, people who get comfortable talking about things like racism, we start to use language and talk about it in a way with each other. I used to be married to someone of another race and a mixed race kid. And the way he and I talk about racism, you might think of as rude, because we're kind of lighthearted and joke about very serious matters because we're very comfortable with it. When I talk with someone who isn't used to talking about it, I use a very different kind of tone and different language. So if it's let's take the track of the new people, and then we can say, if you're more advanced down this road and you really want to level up your game, what would you do? So what do you say for the new people? Where do they get started with this?
Yeah, so I think for new folks for whom this is new, and often those will be folks who have the most privileged identities. So people at the top of our social hierarchy, most specifically white men, white women, white people. And I think, just as I said, focusing in and doing some work with supported work with a consultant around equity itself and how that shows up in your organization. What's your readiness? Where the learning? What learning do you need to do? What application do you need to do? Just focusing on that centrally.
Yeah.
Before, it's kind of like, okay, we're going to learn to swim before we start doing cross-training.
You're right.
The equity-centered strategic planning is cross-training. It's taking what you've learned from swimming to, I don't know, biking, whatever.
Yeah, I love it.
Sports where you need all the things. A triathlon, let's say. So then with that work done, and it's never done. With that work done, that's a misphrase if I ever want one. With having done some work in that direction, you may then say, okay, we have a strategic planning process coming up. We've gotten clear about that this is very important to our organization. We want to make sure that we're paying attention to this as we do strategic planning. And then you can bring that lens, and it's about, bringing that inclusive perspective. And so one of the things that would be different than a perhaps more traditional strategic planning process is that there's a wider group of people who are involved, just simply. It's not just about a strategic planning task force deciding everything for everyone, or the board, or the executive team. It's building an inclusive process that allows people to bring their ideas, but then also is clear about who's going to make the ultimate decision. Usually that is the board. Who will work on refining the plan once a larger group has kind of brainstormed and come up with, a skeleton of a draft. So I often see strategic planning as kind of like an accordion. Sometimes you're going a little narrower, sometimes you're going wider. That's with people, but that's also with ideas.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're going really wide and you're doing all the brainstorming, but then you need to have some ways to kind of bring it back and make some decisions. So it's not a one or the other. It's more of a, how can we integrate these things, and how can we bring more people in, and how can we be clear with them how the process will move forward and how their input will be used.
Yeah, I love it. So let's talk about, and I think that's really key. I just want to echo what you said for everyone out there. If you are new to this, having a guide is so important. Don't just be a bunch of people kind of like wielding around in the desert alone. Get some help with someone who has helped others navigate this process. And I think you'll find that you can have a really um rewarding experience. I know I found all of my work, and I've seen a lot of people going through the work of putting on different lenses, if you will, and peeling back the layers of biases and
Mm-hmm.
inequities.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be very soothing to the soul, I think, even to realize, I think sometimes we're afraid initially to face our own biases, but once you've done it a little, it can relieve you from pressures you might have been under from your family or culture that you grew up with. And I think one side of biases that we don't talk about is they put pressure on us often, not just on other people. And becoming more aware of them can feel good, can feel really good and healing.
100%. I mean, I started with saying, I grew up in a family that didn't really recognize that people had feelings. Well, that's part of, dare I say it, white supremacy culture, right? Like that is part of our dominant heritage, the shadow side of it. And so being more whole, embracing our entire, our whole body, our whole mind, is part of that healing process. And I also find that these processes as a group is healing.
Yeah.
In that and enriching, because people get to know each other better. People get to know the organization better. They have a better understanding of how the different parts go together. They have perspective about what the board does, what their other colleagues do that they don't work with every day. They walk away with a much richer understanding of the organization and why the direction that everybody has decided on is the one that's important. And new people. I've heard new board members say, "Well, I can't contribute anything to this process because I'm brand new."
Mm.
Well, number one, that's not true, because beginner's eyes are a wonderful
Yes.
resource to be able to question all sorts of assumptions, right? I'm sure you appreciate
Oh,
that
yeah.
in
Whenever
your
I
work.
meet somebody, before I contaminate you with my thinking, tell me your opinions because you're going to see things I'll never see. So,
You're
right.
going to see things that people are just taking for granted, and it's just the way
You know,
things are.
I have a great story about that. I walked into a staff retreat. It was a full day staff retreat where I was going to do a session. And so I came in halfway through at lunchtime, and then my session was after lunch. And I walk into this organization. There are about, 60 people eating lunch. And I just look at the room and it's racially divided. And,
Hmm.
they're just each other's colleagues and they hadn't really seen it. But I'm like, wow, all the Black people
Hmm.
are on the left and all the white people are on the right. And that happened not because they,
Sure.
segregated themselves, but over time, because of the history of privilege, the kind of more administrative positions were mostly filled by white people, and the more kind of boots on the ground positions were mostly filled, they were the lower paying jobs, were mostly filled by Black people. And they were just sitting with their colleagues at work. But boy, did it shine out like a sore thumb to me. I was like, whoa, hello here. So yeah. Anyway, carry on. Let's talk about the more folks who are more kind of advanced, who are ready to really dig in. What are some, if you could just give us like some examples of things that people have done that you thought were like really courageous or out there or bold? Because I think examples really help spur people's imaginations.
Sure, sure. Yeah, so part of it is being, asking those questions in the kind of upfront part of the listening tour that you take before you do any kind of planning and discussing. And then it's, I think, often most powerful when organizations look at, for each of their goals, those 3 to 5 big goals that they're going to be working on for the next 3 to 5 years. How are they actually integrating that equity lens into each, instead of having kind of a separate
Mhm.
let's do this. Let's do this. Oh, and by the way, let's work on equity.
Right. We're not just
But,
going to treat it as a side bucket.
How can we do fundraising with an equity? How can we build our board and leadership and organizational culture with that perspective? So really integrating it into what they're doing. And then I think it just takes you that one step further to of that continuous reminder when it's really built in.
Yeah. That's interesting. So in the method that I teach nonprofits to run their organizations, there's a series of meetings, and I developed a DEI checklist that is to be just completed anonymously or not, whatever, by every team member after every meeting. And the idea is that it just brings that lens, like it's just a little reminder, right? So there's checklists, was anybody, maybe not able to attend or had difficult attending because there were stairs. There's a bit of racial things
Right.
that might have come up, and gender-based things and physical disability-based things, and the various lenses, because it's hard to keep it all in your head, and especially when you're focused on the meeting. But somebody once commented on the training that oh, well, you can't just apply a checklist approach to diversity. But this isn't about checking off whether or not you did it. It's about using a checklist to remember. And if you can do that every time you plan, if you can do it every time you meet, if you can try to remember to bring your lenses every time, that's right, how it starts embedding into everything. It sounds like that's what you're talking about. How deep can you go?
Yeah, and I love that because no, it's not the be all and end all, right? And I don't think you were claiming that. It's just a tool to and meetings. I read somewhere recently, I think it was Priya Parker, who talked about how for organizations, meetings are the kind of deliverer of culture.
Yes.
So that's a very powerful intervention for everyone to be thinking about it every single time, not once every 3 years when you're doing strategic planning, but every day.
Right.
So yeah, it really needs to go at all levels, every day, individually, interpersonally, groups. It's all of it. And I just do the one particular part and you do a different particular part, right? But all of it comes together to support that work and building those muscles. I mean, that's what it's about, building those muscles.
It's such I think we'll wrap up there because that's the perfect thing, right? The lenses, if you take two things away from this conversation, what I'm hearing is learning to see through different lenses and building those muscles around using those lenses and kind of expanding, how much they can see so that you can be doing this work, every few years, yearly, monthly, weekly. Can you get it down to daily? Can you get it into everything that you do? But you don't just start on day one doing it in everything that you do. You've got to start.
Well, right. I mean, it's like if you think of that, you're starting an exercise routine and you're starting to do some weightlifting, and at first it's going to be really uncomfortable. And so talking directly about race for many people is very uncomfortable. And so they have to start with just, a 5-pound weight of whatever version that is. That's where they start. But yeah, it's a great analogy.
Yeah, I love that. Well, any final words of advice or things you recommend people take away from our conversation today? And then any way people should get in touch with you if they are interested in having you be their guide?
Yeah, I think we talked about whether it, focusing on what do we need to overcome versus what are we working towards. I mean, my whole goal is to help do my little part to help organizations that then ultimately help all of us live in a world where we can all thrive, no exceptions.
I love that. And we're going to include Carol's contact info in the show notes so you can connect with her on LinkedIn, which it sounds like, is that where you are most these days, LinkedIn?
Yeah, so check out Mission Impact because you're a podcast listener. You can find me at gracesocialsector.com, and then you can find me on LinkedIn as well. I do have a pretty common name, Carol Hamilton. But if you Carol Hamilton and Mission Impact or Grace Social, you'll find me. So thanks.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you, Carol. And thank you out there for listening, but also for all that you do to make our communities better. Take care of yourself. Take time for self-care. Take some time to try on those equity lenses. And be sure to subscribe and listen to the next episode of Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Until then, all the best.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.